Director of the Academy, Reverend Udo Hahn, Dr. Joachim Herrmann, Minister of State, Bishop Dr. Heinrich Bedford Strom, Chairman of the German Protestant Churches, distinguished guests, esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Peace be upon you. Assalamu alaikum. Shalom. Please accept my sincere gratitude for the invitation to be with you here today, and the even greater honor you do me by asking me to address this August gathering. I have heard a great deal of the beauty of this setting and of its important history and significance, so I am impressed and suitably humbled. I am particularly grateful for the recognition given to Religions for Peace, which is the organization I have the incredible privilege of being able to lead once I get my US work permit. Religions for Peace is the oldest interreligious organization, founded precisely, as Reverend Udo Hahn and other distinguished speakers have mentioned, precisely for the purpose of peace writ large. As such, it is a unique organization with a unique history, and its strength is in some of what I will share with you today, its strengths and its challenges. I have been asked to share some thoughts with you about the peace-building power of religion. Now, I confess, given the theme, I originally wrote a 15-page, 10,000-word paper. I was very kindly and very tentatively advised that perhaps I could just keep to a maximum of 45 minutes, which really doesn't involve 10,000 words at all. Trying to understand this meant that perhaps I should, I thought to myself, try to redraft in the proverbial 3 points, which apparently is the average most people can retain, especially if there is to be some beverage of alcohol to be taken at some point. But then, from 10,000 words to 3 points was a great deal more than my Mediterranean mind could possibly handle, especially because the Mediterranean is the space with a historical consciousness from whence 3 Abrahamic religious traditions emerged and, to some extent, still struggle to coexist. So really, it was a great deal more than I could possibly cope to go that small. So what I will do instead is share with you a few reflections about the peace-building power of religion in 5 points and a half. My first point is the context, just to explain a little bit further and perhaps to complement what the distinguished previous speakers have already highlighted. I wish to explain the context in which we live and how I see it. I believe that we are living in times not unlike some of the salient features of 1930s Europe, except today they are not only a feature of the then colonial Europe, but they are actually a global phenomenon. We now witness nations with significant military might systematically undermining many human rights, from privacy to the right to health, and subverting the rule of law in their own countries and globally. In fact, the news sometimes feels to me as if one is reading one of those science fiction comics. Here are some nations annexing territories and oceans they claim as their own. There, some nations literally rounding up certain religious minorities into re-education camps, with even some of their own religious leaders defending the usage and language of sovereignty to deal with terrorism, and therefore they need the camps, like other nations surely need to deal with terrorism. Yet others are in the throes of redefining citizenship rights of select religious groups, while yet others are busy dishonoring and or reneging on the fundamental and hard-won rights of their indigenous peoples. In short, we live today, it seems to me, real-life stories of might makes right and the Darwinian survival of the fittest. Indeed, these appear to be today's normal. In such contexts, the rule of law, indeed the very legitimacy and viability of all types of modern-day institutions, whether they're political, financial, economic, or cultural, these legitimacies of such institutions have never been more vulnerable. So indeed, we are questioning the very legitimacy of most of the institutions that we have today. Multilateral institutions, which are usually made up of some of the same nation states, of which we today speak of as either fragile or failed, these same multilateral institutions are themselves facing, obviously, a serious challenge of credibility. Unfortunately, among those is the United Nations, whose main pillars are peace and security, human rights, and sustainable human development. Therefore, with the challenge to this multilateral institution, with the challenge to its credibility, there is actually a challenge to the very values it stands for and seeks to defend. In other words, we are living in times where the main narratives of might makes right challenge the very pillars of our human civilization, as we knew and erected and defended since the Second World War. Now, this is all further exacerbated by an unprecedented access to information, thanks to all types of media technology. This unprecedented access to information is rampant enough to confuse and question anything that we would term as truth. And it also, altogether, is happening in a context where the very oxygen our planet breathes and needs is being eroded. I hear you thinking, indeed, I believe I can feel some of you getting somewhat bemused by the bleakness of this context, because I am, of course, not describing a pretty picture or painting a present reality. So this brings me to my second point, that of power versus force. In his seminal work on power versus force, An Anatomy of Human Consciousness, The Hidden Determinants of Human Behavior, Professor David Hawkins amalgamates several scientific approaches, including adaptive kinesiology, which is the study of muscle movement, and nonlinear dynamics, to investigate the very nature of consciousness itself. Hawkins' argument is complex, but the main tenets of relevance here are an appreciation that mind, consciousness, body, muscle, values, beliefs, social and environmental dynamics are all part of one whole cosmos, therefore, in fact, one whole being. The implications of this oneness, Hawkins and many others, by the way, maintain, also requires us to appreciate not only our interconnectedness as a human species, part of a common universe, but it also enables our consciousness to distinguish and react differently to force and to power. Force, Hawkins maintains, and please remember this for a little later, force polarizes, it repels, it weakens, it sells out freedom for expediency, it is self-serving, it involves the sacrifice of others rather than self. It is limited and it appeals to our lower nature. Force is not about service. Force is about taking. In fact, Hawkins' explanation of force is the understanding of what much research and discourse over the years, particularly in the field of social and political development, international relations, and the like, all of these features actually have been attributed to power in our usual ordinary social science and political science literature. But what Hawkins proves through numerous experiments is that our very muscles, and thus our entire consciousness, reacts differently to force than it does to power. Power here is the polar opposite to force. It can be inclusive, attractive, strengthening, nurturing, principled in its standing for freedom and integrity. It is about service to others. In short, according to Hawkins' power appeals to our higher nature. While there is much that can be argued, and indeed is, about these assertions, and indeed much has been said in support and contradiction of Hawkins and this entire field of research, I would nevertheless wish to utilize this distinction between force and power and juxtapose it to the dynamics dealt with here. So please bear with me. We can say, and indeed has been said by the distinguished speakers already, that established democratic regimes, that even established democratic regimes, are increasingly struggling to disentangle themselves from a series of crippling financial and political debacles, many of which based their credibility and modus operandi on force, market force, military force, defensive force, preemptive force, or the force of racial or ethnic or religious superiority. At the same time, new centers of financial and military and militant force are emerging, some with priorities which appear to harken back to colonial times, where an overt interest in raw materials, control over land and seas, as well as other resources, all seem to dictate the terms of engagement. Other decentralized loci of violence, i.e. of force, are spread out over urban centers in the form of gangs in some parts of the world and in silent cells waiting to strike or kill or maim in other parts of the world. All this is taking place, it would seem, and receiving an inordinate amount of airtime, far more than an interest in nurturing, in protecting, in securing conformity with human rights aspirations, democratic ideals, or even the rule of law. Yet it is precisely these aspirations of human rights, dignity, adherence to international human rights and humanitarian laws that I would posit as power. We are indeed living in an era of force, not of power. This brings me to my third point. Religions as institutions, as leaders of various backgrounds, ages, and theologies, and as non-governmental and supposedly civic actors, are very much implicated in this force. Religions are part of the myriad vortex of force. The unique abilities of social mobilization which religious actors have historically been capable of can and does significantly shift attitudes and behaviors. These shifts can ultimately be conducive to peaceful coexistence between diverse communities, or the lack thereof, to sustainable human and planetary development, or the unsustainability thereof. My third point is that religions are as power and as force. Religions pronounce on all aspects of life, dealing with money, material wealth, sexuality, political influence, social justice, among many things. As such, religions have the potential to provide guidance to daily life, to social coherence, for solidarity, for justice, for peace and nonviolent resistance and tolerance. Indeed, the history of the world is replete with many examples and instances where religious institutions and religious actors played a fundamental role in the search for social justice and the achievement thereof. At the same time, some religious organizations, whether religious institutions or just community-based groups, have their own internal power dynamics. They may engage in questionable external outreach, certainly claim absolute truth, and go so far as to instrumentalize or allow the use of religion to justify acts of war and outright atrocities. It is important to recognize both the potential and the risks inherent in the relationship of religions to social, political, and financial dynamics. It is not an either fully bleak picture or a fully positive picture. These very same possibilities and dangers and ambiguities are part and parcel, or they should be, of engaging religious actors in social and political processes, indeed, in development, including peacemaking as a whole. So here we come to some important dilemmas inherent to the governmental engagement with religions in peace-building dynamics. There are, or there should be, questions as to the identity and representativity of faith-based actors. This is particularly relevant given the difference between religious institutions, which are largely male-dominated and rife with internal power dynamics as much as they do good, and between informal religious actors serving at hearts of their communities, sometimes without any institutional infrastructure. Some of the questions that need to be asked that are rarely asked. 1. With and to whom are we actually talking to when we are speaking with representatives of religious communities? Who is excluded from the dialogue and the consultations that are taking place? To what extent is the governmental outreach taking into consideration, or indeed potentially contributing to, issues of asymmetry of power between diverse religious groups and communities? Is the governmental engagement with religious actors contributing towards social cohesion and inclusion of all, i.e., is it contributing to power? Or is there the possibility of some collateral damage, i.e., the silencing and marginalization of some voices? Whether and to what extent are religious actors directly or indirectly also contributing to supporting dictatorial regimes which are sabotaging democratic values? Does it follow logically that we can make a case for the unique value of religious actors, which we hear frequently? We quote the facts and the figures about the extent of their social service and their capacities to effect social norm change, all of which is absolutely correct. But at the same time, we absolve them of any responsibility for the rise of xenophobia, religiously motivated violence, the continuing stigmatization of others, whether women, LGBTIQ communities, migrants, HIV-positive people, to name but a few. And thus we collude with cherry-picking certain human rights, which some religious institutions and some actors remain notorious for. There are some human rights which are human rights. There are some human rights which we can turn a blind eye to. This ambiguity must not become the cause of ignoring religion altogether, as the European continent successfully did for decades. Nor must this ambiguity be ignored in the largely governmentally inspired rush to engage with religions as the peacemakers par excellence, often without learning from the glaring lessons of history. After all, apartheid was religiously sanctioned by some credible religious institutions, as was fascism, as is the ugly hydra of non-state violence and severe state repression in other parts of the world. Religions are the quintessential double-edged sword of force and of power. The Central African Republic is an example of this double-edged sword of religious involvement in conflict resolution. Many religious entities, whether religious institutions or faith-inspired non-governmental organizations, are often the first recourse for victims of the conflict. And yet when the conflict escalated, the very identity of a religious entity became its liability. Appreciating the double-edged sword of religions in this case, in fact, requires a deeper understanding of political military nuances rather than of religion itself. On the other hand, as experience in the same country illustrates, faith-based organizations are critical deliverers of services, basic services to the poorest and the most marginalized, with some religious organizations claiming they provide an average of even 40% of just health care, not to take into account nutrition and sanitation. In fact, in other countries across sub-Saharan Africa, because they are deeply rooted and well-managed, some of these faith-based organizations work in tandem with governments and successfully engage in public-private partnerships, which is a big deal today. Their experience also translates into an unparalleled database and knowledge capacities, identifying what people need, how best to serve some of the most marginalized, and how to support governments to serve the most vulnerable. So where does this leave us? Clearly, with a need to re-evaluate religions themselves are understood, and the means with which secular domains seek to engage with the ostensibly sacred ones. This is especially relevant within the context of current geopolitical dynamics of power, including sustainable development and its indivisible component, peace building. So this brings me to the fourth point. Working with religion is, or should be, the ultimate humbling experience for any policymaker or decision taker in any institution or office. Working with religions for the sake of peace requires, in fact, it demands the humility of power and the power of humility. A well-known writer, Arab Lebanese writer, once said, and I quote, "There is too much focus on the impact of religion on man, and not enough on the impact of man on religion." Amin Ma'alouf, by the way. Engaging with religious beliefs and or religious engagements of any kind should be the ultimate lesson in humility. I'm repeating it intentionally. And yet what we are increasingly seeing is an imperceptible move towards arrogance. We often hear the refrain of how people have studied. Some policymakers, some diplomats, some CEOs today will often say how they have studied religion at some point or other, or they've got some graduate degree in religion and conflict and peace building. And there is an implicit assumption that by saying this, we are affirming that we have a firm grasp on religion and religious engagement. But seriously, which theology does anyone study that can prepare us for the hydra faces of very odd jurisprudence of force, which some religiously inspired supremacists are enacting today in different parts of the world, employing different religions? Which theology enables us to understand that? Which political science do we study to fully and deeply grasp how and why some politicians play the religion card while some religious leaders play the political card in every corner of the world at specific moments in history? And which of the religious exegesis and forms of practice studied covers each and every religion, theology and praxis? Where's that? It may be wise to acknowledge that while some religious peacemakers can and do contribute to achieving the sustainable development goals and facilitating and transformation required, not all religious leaders and actors are well placed, nor indeed able to do so. In fact, I would contend that there is no evidence to justify the assertion that religious actors are better placed on their own to understand local contexts or even to occupy the moral high ground and enjoy the trust of civil servants, in spite of this often being said. What I would maintain is that to successfully collaborate with religious actors, a careful analysis of their respective profiles and track records are mandatory, including their own self-critical reflections, if any. Because religions can be the tool of the righteous, but not necessarily always the right, as unfolding political events in supposedly peaceful contexts continue to demonstrate. This brings me to my fifth point. We often hear of religious literacy. We need religious literacy, say many policymakers today. Beyond religious literacy, however, I contend that we need a competency in civic engagement for human rights. What is required is a competency to deal with civil society dynamics, including inter and intra-religious sensibilities, and simultaneously with relational secular sensitivities, with a clear objective of human rights, not implicit, but explicit. Precisely because all religions, institutions, and actors have multiple dimensions, it is imperative that we ensure religious beliefs and praxis are in alignment with human rights principles and laws. Disputes pertaining to human rights, especially women and girls' rights, are often seen as somehow unrelated to the real business at hand. That's peacemaking, of course. Yet there is, or should be, no question that we need to dare to challenge harmful practices, including gender-based ones, and to uphold all principles of human rights for all people at all times. Indeed, it is precisely because of these contested domains, i.e. the contested sensitive issues, that religions have to be a critical part of our engagements on peacemaking. Religions matter because they are part of a civic, political, social, economic fabric, not because they stand alone and outside. Therefore, selecting religious leaders to work on select issues without enabling an integration of the religious into the broader civic efforts aimed at realizing the human rights of all, i.e. a whole of society approach, per definition, this selection is flawed. Assuming that you can engage largely male religious leaders as peacemakers or peace builders, while turning a blind eye to the fact that some of them may be bigots, homophobes, or plain hypocrites in Hannah Arendt's terms, is an act of force, because it will ultimately polarize, repel, and weaken the efforts at hand. It's also important to bear in mind that part of the value of secular engagement with religious actors in or for peace building is that it should enable an introspection within the very same entity embarking on the process of partnership. In other words, by reaching out to point to work with religious actors, there has to be a finger pointing within at the same time. If the engagement with religious actors does not compel us to question and be self-critical about and within the secular institutions, then that engagement has failed. Because the self-critical, self-reflexive approach is on both sides, the religious and the secular, and both have to benefit with a little bit more of introspection and self-criticism of one another through the engagement with one another. It is not about one using the other. My note of warning, which is the half point, and that has to do with the road to barbarism. Reflecting on Edward Said, whom I hope many of you know, but reflecting on Edward Said and his thesis on Orientalism should remind us that one of the Orientalist myths is that religion is a uniquely determining force in the Arab Islamic world. It's an Orientalist myth. In a similar vein, I maintain that it is an Orientalist myth to believe that religion is a uniquely determining force in peacemaking. Edward Said noted, and I quote, "Orientalism failed to identify with human experience, failed also to see a particular reality as human experience." Referencing this, Professor Adam Schatz notes that if the global war on terror has taught us anything, it is that the road to barbarism begins with the failure to identify with human experience, the failure also to see a particular reality as a human experience. I maintain that where and when religious partnerships are seen as a transactional feature in business as usual policy and praxis, or one of the many elements in the toolbox of peacemaking, unique or not, or indeed part of our foreign policy priority or developmental approach, we are failing to see religion as a human experience. Actually, religions should not be subject to what we do with all the other tools at our disposal. Religions are not for use. I put before you here that religions are ultimately a universe of human experiences of faith. Therefore, they are inherently intangible, unquantifiable, and user-unfriendly. If we fail to see that human experience, we are on the road to barbarism, and we are risking a consolidation of a vortex of force. To be agents of power, might we actually have to come to terms with the irony that in order to realize the peace-building power of religions, we might have to consider religious considerations and partnerships outside of our public and policy-making spheres altogether? Is it conceivable, therefore, and I am intentionally provocative, is it conceivable, therefore, that to be agents of the peace-building power of religions, we may need to render unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's? Ladies and gentlemen, I come from a part of the world where Habermas could only influence so many, because we never saw, many of us, never saw faith and reason as two distinct things. For many of us, I am one of those. Faith is reason, and reason is faith. 30-odd years of working with different religious actors on the intersection of the religious, the political, governance, and the human rights issues has taught me at least one thing. One, of course it's never going to be just one. One, that religions are not user-friendly, and that it is a very, very complicated terrain indeed to try to work and use the religious spaces and spheres. Two, that religious engagement and engagement with religious actors is ultimately a matter of service, not of use. Three, that when we work with religions, it is about learning how to be self-critical. And that is four, that when we work with religions, it must, at a minimum, inspire a great deal of radicalism. But what kind of radicalism? Radical mercy, radical compassion, radical love, and radical inclusion. And if we think about it for a second, with all that radicalism inside us, how can we not be agents of peace and of power? I thank you, and I bid you once again peace now and always.